This week we're going to review what we saw last week when it comes to composition and the elements, and then we're going to start to play with when they begin to interact with each other. So we know if we look at this piece, it's a ad that's designed for Nike, right? It's beautiful how this piece is actually divided in quadrants. So what we have going on here is simultaneously, we have symmetry, right? And then we have asymmetry. So if she is asymmetrical, that she's coming into and activating the negative space. Positive space, negative space, if we think about that donut, positive space, when we see through it, it's the whole. So with that, we're creating space. So what that means is we have a foreground, we have something of a middle ground with this basketball, and then we have a background. So if you think about a two-dimensional image, consider it a three-dimensional plane that you're smushing down. It's going to give you some dynamism, some excitement into your photograph, so it'll feel less flat. So when we come in here, and one of the things is also consider your concept. This is a really great piece of an example of a contrast of concept. So we have something here that invokes the idea of a basketball court, yet it still invokes tennis. So she looks like she's mid-tennis swing, right? Although basketball is being referenced as well, and the court kind of looks like a tennis court too. Something to consider when you're constructing your imagery. So when we come in here, real quick, run through on our elements and principles, and as speaking, I want you to just check yourself. Make sure that we're on the same pattern and we get this. Obvious, line is a point moving in space. Think about how line directs your eye. Right here we begin at the rectangle and we move all the way down to this little point. This point in its isolation creates tension. Tension is something that will really start to engage your viewers. Cool thing to think about, which I'm sure I mentioned before, but think about during the 1800s, photography started coming out, and it had a huge effect on portrait painting. So what you would do is you go out and you get your, if you were of means, you'd have your family portrait painted. Now we didn't need to do that. We can take an image, a replica. So what that happened to fine arts, to the portrait painters, is that we started to get weird and play with color. So no longer did we have to have an image of a person that we needed to recognize. Now we could start to play with abstraction. Other thing I want you to consider is the feeling of space and depth. So just like we spoke about when we talk about this Nike ad, think about the foreground, middle ground, and background, and thinking about activating your negative space. Here's the negative space. These are the buildings. Here's the positive space or the structure. What we're seeing through, we're actually creating a shape onto itself that doesn't have material in it. It's a negative space, that's the sky. The reason that's happening is because we're allowing ourselves to interact with the edges of your picture plane. This helps us create a shape. And we need to always consider ours as our picture plane. You'll see when photographers usually start out, they're not. Something we're going to keep our eye on. Now, movement, implied visual pathway. Think about the contrast in color, the light and dark. Rhythm and repetition, sometimes people get a little picked up around here. We get the rhythm, think about it as music. There's a change here. Repetition is leg, 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 leg. Rhythm is a little shift in that repetition. Medium gray, dark black, white, gray, all the way down through. Pattern, pretty self-explanatory, and when we talk about texture, there's two types of texture. There's implied texture, so think about this as this pavement. We can't touch it, right? It's implied. That there's texture there, but we can still feel it. And then there's physical texture, which we actually can touch. And that's something when you get into sculpture and painting, physical texture becomes something. Again, always when it comes down to it, contrast is king. That's how it goes in fine arts. That's where our eye is going to go first. And the best way to kind of remember this, right, is going to capture our attention. If you think you're sitting in a room, right, and someone walks through the door and there's someone who is wearing black head to toe, right? And then there's someone who's walking a glitter outfit suit, like a disco ball suit. Who are you going to look at first, right? You're going to look at the area that has the most contrast. So think about your image. You know, maybe it's not about taking a hammer and hitting someone over the head and saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. Maybe it's about creating something more subtle. That's for you to decide. Know that our attention will always go to the contrast. So decide what you want to do with your attention. How are you guiding the viewer through your imagery? What type of mood do you want to establish? Alignment. Big thing with alignment, it can become boring real quick, or it can become organized. I'm going to replace that word boring with stable and organized. So when you have something stable and organized, usually we like to see a small upset right? Because it will stop our attention. So here we're walking right down the line, and then what happens? We pop and we see a little circle. That stops us in our path. Still a unity and harmony, right? But a little bit of difference. That's something visually to play with. Scale and size are something students sometimes begin to confuse. Size is the actual size of an object. This guy, large size. Scale is the relationship of the objects with other objects in the picture plane, right? So here we have a big jump in scale. We have a body, right? And the scale goes really up when we start to have these characters. Balance and asymmetry, symmetry, pretty self-explanatory. Asymmetry, when you shift something over to the side, it usually gives you a little more dynamic of a composition. Symmetry is always going to feel very balanced. Number one thing that we talked about last week that you're always going to remember is when it comes down to it, you don't make a photograph. You don't take a photograph, you make the photograph. So composition is integral. Composition is what makes success when you're dealing with imagery. Anything. So if you think you go to a Michelin star restaurant, you sit down on your plate, what you're looking on the plate and how the food is organized is composition. When you look at a runway fashion show and how the relationship of the bodies as they walk down the line in the show is planned. When you look at their outfits, where's the pop of color and the relationship of the size of their body? It's all composition. It extends far beyond the two-dimensional picture plane. One of the things to consider in composition is they did a study of adults from the United States, and they brought them to a museum, and they found out an adult from the United States has the aesthetic vocabulary of a third grader. So think how important composition is. That's going to separate you from the pack when it comes down to image making. So emphasis is something that's going to draw our attention. We know that it's very relative to contrast. So we have this thing in photography, and everything else when it comes to two-dimensional is sometimes three-dimensional. Think about it when you're dressing, is the rule of thirds. So if you take a rectangle and you divide it into the rule of thirds, we have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you go to your phone and you turn on your settings, you're going to find a grid. That is what this is referencing, and it's great to shoot on a grid because it allows you to really own that rule of thirds. And you know, rule of thirds is something to be used, but it's also something to be broken. What you'll find in a rule of thirds, and you'll see it in movies all the time, is that you have a subject, and usually that subject is sitting on a rule of third. And when we look at anything that has to come with animals or people, figures, we zone into their eyeballs. That's where we look. Also, when we look at someone, we see them looking at something else. So if you have a subject that's in a picture plate and they're looking outside of the picture plate, we're going to automatically follow their gaze. Think about that. So here, and you see it in the wolf. If we're looking at the wolf, we're going to follow his gaze down here. If he was up here and he was looking that way, we'd follow his gaze back down here. One of the things I want you to see, the main part of the subject is the wolf. It's its head, it's its eyeball. It's right on that axis of a rule of third. So when we have emphasis, we're building a focal element, and what that's doing is it's drawing our attention. We're telling someone where to look, right? We are almost manipulating their view. These are how we create a focal element. We can do it through high contrast. Contrast is king. Catches our attention, glitter suit. We can do it through saturation, and when we talk about saturation, we're talking about color. So what I want you to think about, if you have when it comes to color theory, we use terminology wrong all the time, and that's a whole nother unit. We'll talk about it. So when people say pastel, they're usually thinking about pastel pink, right? They think about a color that's lighter. Incorrect use of the term, but we'll get there. So if you have a rose that's a pink, call it pastel, right? Pink pastel. And then we have a rose that is a deep red. Saturation is where there's more saturated color. So there's more punch in the color. You can think of it a way as having more pigment in the color. The red rose is going to be more saturated than the pink rose. Camera focus, where are you telling us to focus? You know, is the foreground blurry? Is the background blurry? Is the middle ground focus? Wherever the camera's in focus, that's where we're going to look. You'll find a lot of time when nothing is focused, we don't know where to look. You're not telling your viewer what to do, which means they'll probably walk out of your image. They're not going to look at your image so much. Motion, when we see emotion, you'll see it in like race car photography, where a car is moving and the background's blurry. We're going to focus not on the background, we're going to focus on the car. And we always look at faces and figures. Focal influencers. So how can we get someone to look at our point of focus. What we can do is we can use something called guiding lines, we can use it framing, and we can start to play with geometry. So when we come in here, I have a series of pictures that I've pulled off my camera roll, and I'm going to walk you through how the elements of principles of design are actually working together. So last week was about being able to identify them and take a snapshot, right? This week is about taking them and pairing them and playing with them and activating them. Almost think about them as different crew or different cast members in a crew. Right? So you have all these different individual people that you're coming together and you're having them act as one. So here, rule of third, right? Pumped it, put the sunglasses right on that rule of third. The other thing we have here is an isolation of information, the contrast of the face, isolated by the background and the texture and the sands. Other thing that's happening so beautifully and so subtly is think about where this line is reinforcing us right into the star of the show. Just that little bit of crack line, it's so subtle and it works. The other thing is when we come back up here and we're at the star of the show, usually when we have a line and it's on a diagonal like this, what we do is we usually bang, run out of the canvas. Here we're being stopped. So our line of vision comes here, there's something different, we're stopped. We hang out here. Then we're coming up with this line and we're not allowed to walk right out of the picture plane. We're not allowed because what happens is we have another set of lines that are coming in and directing our eye, which just brings us down here. Then we follow the dark, it brings us down here, then we come back to this little fingerprint and it pops us right back into the head. So you're moving people's eyeballs around your imagery, and it will happen. It will happen when you're looking through the camera and you're like, oh my God. And then you go and you open your camera and you look at post-production and you're like, holy shit, that works. Excuse me. Wow, that works. Tune yourself in, right? When I'm taking this shot, right? I'm taking this was probably 5 shots. And then we got the shot in the sense of click, 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 right? But then when you take your click, 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 you're going to start to actually look at your composition through your viewfinder, and that's what we're getting at right here. When you take imagery, it's not the first image. Sometimes you luck out and you hit it right off the bat. You always want to take a series of images. What happens is we're in the world of digital. You can do that. You don't have to go into a dark room and develop your film, and it costs like 35 bucks. So here we go again. Now we have the isolation of a figure. We have a little bit of contrast when it comes to the color, a monochromatic. Our eye automatically goes here because we see a face. The face is hitting close to a rule of third, right? The rule of third would actually be here. And sometimes, rule of thirds can be boring. So sometimes we need to offset a little bit. But I want you to consider when you look at this image, if this person, that's actually me, my mom took this photo, great place to go, Dia Beacon. It's in Dia, New York. It's a art museum of contemporary art that was installed in a Nabisco factory. So it's all natural light. Gorgeous place to go to see. Gorgeous place to take imagery. Great sculptures where you can get into and interact with and see light fall on. Great place to take a camera. So here, she offset me a little bit, which works, right? Now, check out the subtlety. Look at this darker shape that's coming in, right? How does that reinforce the point of focus, the star of the show? Is that compressing the image of the person, pushing her up, pushing her down, pushing her in with how light or dark that is? Now look at the relationship here. Now this is in the foreground, and so subtly in the foreground. Now here we have a triangle, implied triangle that's happening here. Check out the echo of the triangle that's happening here. See how they come together and interact, pointing in, pointing in. Now here we can start to play with framing. So what framing is when we have our point of focus and we're actually building a frame around it, right? So here the frame is the doorway. Look at the color. Right? So the color, we have a variation in value. Value is how light and how dark a color is. This is the lightest value. This is the mid value. This is the darkest value. So 3s. We love the number 3s. Our eyeballs love 3. So your eye begins to bounce. Right? If you see my arrow move through, it bounces. And that can become about an act of saturation of color. Right? The act of framing, we're pressing us into the spot. Now the repetition of the rectangle, right? And then we're using geometry to kind of divide this picture plane. All right, next one we go through another example of framing, right? We're framing something and pushing us from the foreground to the middle ground to the background. Now here you really got to decide on what you're framing, right? Here, you know, this is an urn. Is it the star of the show? Is it the most engaging thing we're looking at? I don't know. I would say maybe this is. Think about that. Think about where you're focusing your viewer. Now we have something here where the lines are pushing us into that urn. Look at the repetition of the rectangle again, right? Negative space, positive space. Negative space that's defined by the shape of the archway. Always look at the edges of your picture plane. Okay? The other thing is we kind of have this nice interaction of color too. Bop, 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 color, bop. Things to think about. Again, if you ever go to Miami, this is the fashion district, or like their fashion area. It's a cool place to walk around because they really have incorporated sculpture into the interaction of the storefronts. And if you're a fashion person, really great things to check out. So here, again, foreground, middle ground, backgrounds, right? We're activating the negative space. We're framing the subject. This is the subject. And you can kind of see this is where diagonals work for us. And you'll see it all the time. You'll see it in landscape photography when people are starting out. If you have a horizontal, your horizontal has to be true, right? So if you have your head, right? Your head is looking, I don't know if we can see each other, we can't. My head is looking dead out at a horizon. When I start to tilt my head, that horizon starts to come at an angle. Now we know in our brain that horizons are not tilted, right? Here we're making this image dynamic because our horizon is straight, right? They'll consider that we have a horizontal that's straight. Then that is contrasted by a diagonal, right? Then contrasted by a diagonal. Then contrasted by a diagonal. So our eye is starting to bounce. We bounce here, we bounce there, we bounce here. That becomes exciting for our eye, which is why we engage with the photograph. The other thing too is when we talk about geometry, think about the edges of your picture plane, right? Think about it. Look at the shape that happens there, right? And how is that shape playing with the rest of the composition? How is that triangle playing with the composition? Okay. Now here, what do you want to think about when you're dealing with a color? Is really you're in charge of the show here, right? Now this is something that we would call a desaturated image, right? There's not much punch to the image. It's very monochromatic. Now that's going to give me something very different than if I took this image in post-production and I started pumping the color, right? Or if it went back to the side on a sunny blue sky day. Things to think about, right? Very different feel when you have saturated and desaturated colors, monochromatic versus lots of color coming at you. So here, really playing with repetition and rhythm, dot, 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 right? We have our leading lines are pushing us into a contrasting shape, which is the circle. When we come into here, again, we're pushing through lines. Leading lines are pushing us up this staircase. And when we talk about contrast, and it's a beautiful thing to play with in photography because you're going to find it everywhere in the world when you're interacting with your environment, is yeah, we have this idea of two-dimensional contrast with elements of design. But what happens when we start playing with a contrast in concept? Here, this is a mansion in Biscayne, some old historical site, right? People come and they visit it. So check out the remnants. This is an old site. It's got the old trees, right? There's very much a mood. And then we have a baby carriage, right? Now this is someone was outside the shot. That's their baby carriage, right? But look at the world. Observe the world. Look for those areas where you can see contrast and concept because they activate your imagery. South of the border driving down. Really, really serendipitous shot. So here I was like, oh my God, there's a great marriage of a color palette. We got this red, we got this yellow. It's duplicated all over the image. We got a great sense of rhythm, dot, 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 right? And check out what happened here. Is that this line, serendipitously, this guy is like pruning the trees and he just happened to be there and he's wearing a yellow t-shirt and it works completely gorgeous with the color palette and it works fantastic with the composition because it's pushing us right into a little moment of the image, right, that activates. Now that we have a human in here, becomes a different image than if it was just about the object, the absence of human versus the presence of human. Really cool things to play with. All right, and as we go further down, and your eye will start to pick up on these things as you take out a camera. A camera is a great way to teach yourself to see the world, right? We interact with the world all the time. Our eyeballs start to filter stuff out because we're so used to it. When you take that camera and you start looking through your picture, through your frame, You really start to cut out the rest of the noise, and you have control over the image and the composition that you're creating. Here, that quintessential dumb image of shoes and feet. Excuse me, I'm not going to say dumb, that's unfair. But yeah, it's something we see all the time, right? But here, when it comes down to it, check out how much of a contrast, and we're dealing with a contrast of color. Now, this is an image that I would go back in post-production and start to play with. The colors feel a little off. They feel a little bit too artificial. Now, something, if you wanted to go for that artificial, right, then I would pump it even more. If you want to go for something that's a less of a cooler temperature, this is a cool image as opposed to a warm image. If we talk about color temperature, you can play with those things. And really look, you always want to make, digital is a beautiful world, where we got 2 copies of this photo and I edit them both in 2 different ways, and they become 2 different stories, 2 different moods, yet it is the same imagery. Now check out the color isolation, right? Here we had color palette that kind of made a harmony in the image. Here we're telling a different story where we're isolating that color and we're literally putting it in a box, right? Repetition, rhythm, texture, contrast in the texture, smooth to rough, things to think about. Now you want to study your subject, right? Now we usually see a subject and we engage with it and we're like, oh my God, that's great, especially when you start looking about how light falls. Light is one of the most beautiful gifts we have in this world, right? It interacts with everything, and it has so many different personalities. And when you start tuning in, you start seeing that, that's going to make your imagery jump. So we'll see an image or we'll see something and be like, oh my God, that's great, that's beautiful, but you got to study what you're seeing, and you can do that through a camera. And we do it in camera while we're taking the pics. I take multiple pics. You look at your camera roll, there's like 20 of one subject, right? But you can do it after as well. So here I was setting up a still life for the hell of it. I was going to paint, right? And I'm studying, actually I'll study something that I'm going to paint before I paint it by isolating it in the picture plane of a camera first, so I can really understand the composition. And I do it with another means, which we will do as an exercise as we get later down the road. Now here, cool, I got my shot, all right, cool. And then I came in and I started dealing with the most smallest thing, and I'm going to show you how the image changes. I want you to pay attention to this line right here. So here, when we talked about geometry and we talked about activating the edges of the picture plane, right? Look at what a difference this makes. Here I was like, oh my God, if I just crop this in just a little bit, right? Just a little bit, and I take that information out. Now that comes a more intentionally composed image, right? That we've activated this negative space. Now this becomes a shape onto its own that's interacting with this rectangle of shape onto its own. And it happened by removing that little slice. Those subtleties are so important. So incredibly important. And if we look at light and we look at how light falls, check it out. Just that beautiful little triangle. Just small little moments. And they add up when we train our eye with the ability to see. That really becomes something. Here, when we remove this, now this is a contrast between light and dark. And it becomes a little bit smallest of moments, distracting. Here, when we remove it, it becomes calmer. All things to think about. Very quick, very small. Now you can do your post-production at a camera, or you can do it during. When it comes down to it, you want the cleanest shot, the most beautiful composed shot to happen in camera. That's less work that you have to do later down the line, and you nail your shot, right? And then you can go on with playing in color, all this other stuff. You don't want to have cropping where you're twisting the photo and you're trying to like zoom in, and then your pixels are out of focus and it sucks. You always want to have it in camera. That's what the goal is here. We're training our eye to see a great composition in camera. And it's called, photography, it's called chimping, right? So what you do, you take a shot, you look at your screen. You take a shot, you look at your screen. So you're always analyzing. Very important when you're dealing to get things like a tack sharp focus. When we're looking at someone's face, we want that tack sharp. So doing this sort of back and forth play, take a picture, look at a picture, take a picture, you really are discovering your subject. You're evaluating what's happening during the process, and you're doing it quickly, so you're training your eye. You always want to ask if, what if? So if you have a subject and you see it, I was walking down the street somewhere in Florida, and I was like, oh, great, like, look at this cool thing. Like, we got this green color and this blue sky, cool, I'm going to take a picture of it. And when I took the picture, I looked at my phone, And I'm like, it's kind of boring, right? Not much is going in here. Where do you want to push the point of focus for the image, right? It's kind of a little all over. No, for me, it's a little all over the place, right? We do have a shape. We do have this shape interacting. So how can I even push it further? Right? What if I zoom into an area of activation? And so what I was attracted to here was the repetition, dot, 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 right? The, if we talk about concept, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then if we look at the rhythm as well as in this, so we have a rectangle, 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 interacting with rectangle, 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 and it almost becomes like sound. We could think about rhythm like sound, dot, 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 dot. That's exciting for our eye. Then we have this clean line that interacts with all of that. So discover your subject, right? Take a picture. I thought it was going to be cool over here. Nah, this became so much more cooler. Here, really cool in North Carolina somewhere, is walking down the street and see the shadow of a fence. And I'm like, oh, cool. Composition-wise is going to be about, like a contrast in color, contrast in value, the throwing of shadows. And then I started to take this, and it became less about the building a composition. It became more about discovering what that subject was. So looking at this is like, oh my God, this looks like heads. Cool, right? That shadow became for me almost something like Faroe or Easter Island. It's not as obvious that it's the shadow of a fence. And that's something to play with. I would have only seen that if I actually took the image and I started discovering that image in the process of taking it. So I run a collage class, right? Async collage class. And what this is this an example of a project that I was designing for them. And I got so excited making this project. Not in the sense of making it, yeah, cool, making it, putting it together, showing students what to do, but documenting it with a camera. It completely started to change. So I took a picture of it to post for our assignment. Then I'm like, oh my God, awesome. What happens if I zoom in here? Because I'm playing with subjects, but they're actually subjects of photographs as opposed to subjects that I'm evaluating in life, like a woman that's across the room, right? So coming up, I'm like, oh, cool, defining this composition. We got this weird interaction of shape that's happening here with her profile. She's looking down at it, engaging it. Then we have this desaturated monochromatic to a pop of color, texture, smooth texture. All these principal designs are interacting with each other, and that's what your intention of this assignment is to really own that interaction. Be intentional with that interaction. Then I got to feed it even further. I spent probably like an hour, right, studying this piece of art for a project, and I got so deep into it because I actually was engaged and I was seeing things that was happening in the project that I wasn't aware with unless I took out my camera and started playing and documenting it. So think about, even when you're looking at a magazine, right? What happens if you take that magazine and you start to place objects on top of the photo or the pictures that are in there, right? The sky's the limit. This is cellophane. I'm like, cool, what if I put cellophane in front of her face and then we're interacting and looking through the cellophane? Think about looking through surfaces. Even further down, started to play even more, zoomed in. Okay, which one is the stronger photograph, right? Is it about her eyeball? If it is about her eyeball, okay, let me get into that eyeball a little bit deeper. Let me make that more the star of the show. Really changes the image. Then I'm like, okay, what happens if I push this thing down? So I'm asking myself all these questions while I'm shooting. That's what your job is to do. It's not taking, you don't take a photograph, you make the photograph. And making the photograph happens when the process of photographing, making the picture happens in the process of photographing your subject, right? That's what happens. And here I got a whole series of body of work, which is cool. Got like 5, 10 images, whatever out of this. Then even to the point when your brain starts firing off and you start seeing things differently and you start seeing them through the guises and elements of the principles of design, you're going to make discoveries. I was so excited about this. So what I was doing, I was going through and I was popping through the photographs on my iPhone. And then I started zooming into the screen and I'm like, oh my God, this is really cool. I got this repetition of the rectangle. I got this implied movement of a line that's moving through. How her eyes starts to jump and become actually organized. Start to switch in the idea of a point of focus here. And then zooming in on her face. So I was on my iPhone, I zoomed in, and I took a screenshot. I'm like, oh my God, that's a cool standalone photograph. Think about that. Even the photograph can happen not in your camera. It can happen in the development of the post-production by looking at the interaction of the shapes on your screen, right? That's by lighting up your brain. Yeah, you're lightening up your brain because you're teaching yourself how to see. And that's what the intention here is. That's what the intention of this course is. Yes, you will learn photography. Yes, you will learn how to control your cameras through the medium of a smartphone. What I want you to walk away with is the ability to actually see as a designer, as a photographer, as an artist. So what you're going to do is you're going to compose your images. You're going to take 10 photographs. In reality, you probably will take 20, 30, 40 photographs, because I want you to go through that process of discovery as you take your images. And then you're going to choose your best 10. You're going to upload that through Google Drive. Then you're going to pop the link into the body of the portal of Blackboard submission for me. It can be any subject, anything. I want you to think about this as going and discovering the world, right? And I want you to try different things. There is so much experimental that goes into creating art. It's like being a scientist, right? Is that you're like, oh, what if I try this? And then if I move this over here, what happens here? Or what if I move this over here and this happens here? What if I pour water on top of a magazine as I take a photograph? What if I light something on fire and I watch flames happen and I start documenting that process? All things to ask yourself. Try, experiment. You can't fail. That's what it comes down to. The only thing you can do is grow, learn, and progress. It's the nature of the medium. It's the nature of digital. You don't like them? That's all right. Don't throw them away. Save them. I gotta tell you right now how much I have learned and how much of my own work that I don't throw away, that years later, a couple of years later, months later, whatever, I go back to, I'm like, oh my God, what happened there? What if I do this now? Right? So you're always going to evolve with your work. And I encourage you not to throw it away. Right? Set up a file on a shared whatever cloud and keep that stuff, because you may find something later down the line, especially if you get into the idea of working with things like Photoshop or Procreate, where you can start to collage, right? If you print the images out and you have an area that you want to cut out, if you want to do that digitally or physically, all things, right? Think about this as a visual diary for you. You're creating content that you can do whatever you want with. You can explore and experiment with. So 10 photographs, any subject. I don't necessarily want you to create a series. This is something we would call a series because it is a light color palette. It's the same subject in different manners and ways. I want you to actually go out and take a bunch of different images that potentially could be a series. Don't show me a series. You may actually find out you have a series on your phone just through the process of taking the imagery. We will get to series. We will build a portfolio of a project that is a series. Right now, I want you to play and experiment as much as possible. Don't create a series. Create 10 individual standalone photographs of any subject. Has to be different subjects from each other. Reminder of what we were before, right? Identifying those things. Now I want you to make them interact and control them. Where's my point of focus? Am I playing with the rule of third, right? Where is the interaction? Can I get something that's a texture? Can I start to play with color? How do leading lines work? Where's the texture? Where's the pattern? Where's the rhythm? All these things are coming together for you. And you're playing with them, manipulating them. And number one thing, you're orchestrating an image. That's what you're in charge of here. Think about it like music. You're creating order by thinking about what you're not photographing and focusing on what you are. The viewfinder is a way for you to turn off the rest of the world. All right, so there was a problem with the quiz. And we'll run into Blackboard issues. It's just the nature of the beast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop the quiz into this week, and I am going to give you the answers right now. And what this quiz is, it's literally just a way to make sure that we're on the same page and we understand some of the basic things for this course. It's like administrative stuff. So number one thing, are assignments only turned in through Blackboard's assignment portal? No, that's false. We upload them from Google Drive and we pop that link into our body copy submission. This is an easy way to get 100, right? Late assignments can be turned in anytime. No, you have 1 week to turn in late assignments. Based on our over enrollment, you got to get them in time, right? We are so packed to the brim, looking at hundreds of photographs. I need those to be within 1 week of the late date uploaded. Now, the thing is too, life happens. If you have a problem, just let me know. That's all I ask. And we'll work together. This isn't about penalizing you. This is about helping you succeed. Please get your late assignments in with a week. Let me know if you have any issues. Also, please text me. I run a studio, work multiple jobs. I'm all over the place. I have multiple Outlook accounts. I need you to text me because I'm not going to get your email until a couple days later. All right, so your Google Drive shoulder is private and can be only viewed by you. No, that's a public area. So if you're discovering a subject that is more intimate to you, right? Or if there's something you're not comfortable necessarily, do you want other people to see? Right? That's okay. That's absolutely okay. Just be aware that your Google Drive shared folder is not private and anybody and everyone can look at it within this course. So if there is something you're working on that you'd like to keep private for yourself, just let me know. We can set up, actually, I'm going to put that in your hands. You can set up a private folder on your own Google Drive, and then you can invite me with a link, and we can do it that way. And if you want to walk through that together, we can do that. Okay, and I encourage you to actually get into each other's folders because you'll start to see how other people see. That's one of the beautiful things about art making and image making photography is we all interact with the world and see the world differently. Pop in there, look at each other's work. There is a midterm to this course? No, false. This course does not have a midterm. It does have a midterm grade, and your midterm grade is based on the accumulation of your work to date, right? Important to get those assignments in. We don't want any holes. Actually, as well as to give you a heads up, sometimes I don't submit midterm grades for seniors. I do submit them for freshmen. It depends on the course and where we're at. I may submit them for everybody. I may submit them for a through. That all becomes an individual basis, especially if you run into something in life where you're having some issue with getting assignments in, which please just let me know. All right. You can rely on Google's Drive shoulders shared folder to store your photos. They won't be deleted. You cannot rely on Google Drive shared folders to store them there. All right, they will be deleted eventually. So make sure that you're backing up your images. Create a folder on your desktop. Create a folder you copy and paste in Google Drive. They won't be guaranteed that they're there. The other thing that happens, and it's happened in this course before, is that people will pop images into Google Drive. Something will happen or maybe someone else goes into the folder and they accidentally delete them. That thing actually does happen. Or someone puts it in the wrong folder and then they try to move it and then we have an issue. Other photos came with it. Always keep another folder on your desktop wherever you want to. Keep duplicates of your images. They will be deleted. They won't be there after the course. So false. They will be deleted at some point and you're risking. And that's about it. If you have any questions, fire off a text and I'm happy to help. And I look forward to seeing your work.